Not every avoidant is incapable of change. Not every withdrawal pattern is permanent. Not every relationship with an avoidant attachment style is doomed to repeat the same cycles of hot and cold, closeness and distance, hope and disappointment. There are moments when something fundamental shifts inside the avoidant, when they move beyond surface-level behavioral adjustments into genuine transformation, when their love for you becomes powerful enough to override their fear of vulnerability. These shifts are rare and they're profound, and recognizing them is crucial because walking away during genuine transformation means losing a relationship that could have evolved into something secure and lasting. The challenge is distinguishing between authentic change and temporary improvement, between an avoidant who's genuinely doing the work to heal their attachment wounds and an avoidant who's simply managing their patterns enough to keep you from leaving. The shifts that indicate real love and genuine transformation aren't dramatic declarations or grand gestures. They're subtle but significant changes in how the avoidant shows up, in their consistency, their communication, their willingness to be uncomfortable, their integration of you into their life, their accountability for their patterns. When you see these shifts happening not once but sustained over time, not in response to threat of loss, but from internal motivation, not with resentment, but with genuine desire to be a better partner, you're witnessing something precious, an avoidant who loves you enough to face the very things they've spent their life avoiding. They start initiating difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. The first and most significant shift that indicates an avoidant genuinely loves you is when they begin initiating difficult conversations instead of avoiding them, when they stop using withdrawal as their primary response to discomfort and start moving toward vulnerability and communication instead. For an avoidant, difficult conversations represent everything they fear: exposure, vulnerability, potential conflict, the risk of being seen as inadequate or wrong. Their entire attachment strategy has been built around avoiding these moments, changing the subject, stonewalling, or physically removing themselves when conversations venture into emotional territory. When an avoidant begins not just tolerating these conversations, but actually initiating them, it reveals a fundamental shift in their relationship to vulnerability and their commitment to the relationship's health over their own comfort. This shift manifests when the avoidant brings up relationship issues before you do, when they notice something is off, and address it rather than hoping it will resolve itself through avoidance. They might say, "I've noticed I've been distant this week, and I want to talk about what's happening for me." Or, "I need to tell you about something I'm struggling with," rather than pulling away like I usually do. These initiations are awkward at first. The avoidant isn't naturally skilled at emotional communication, and their attempts may be clumsy or incomplete. But the fact that they're trying, that they're choosing discomfort over avoidance, that they're moving toward rather than away from difficulty, is itself evidence of transformation. The shift also appears when the avoidant stays present during difficult conversations that you initiate rather than shutting down or withdrawing. Previously, when you brought up concerns about their behavior or expressed hurt about their patterns, they might have become defensive, blamed you for being too sensitive, or simply left the conversation emotionally or physically. But when genuine shift occurs, they remain engaged even when uncomfortable. They listen instead of planning their defense. They ask questions to understand your experience rather than immediately explaining why you're wrong to feel hurt. They sit with the discomfort of hearing about their impact instead of deflecting or minimizing. This capacity to stay present through discomfort is perhaps the most reliable indicator of authentic change, because it's the opposite of the avoidance foundational coping mechanism. This transformation includes the avoidant discussing their feelings an internal experience rather than keeping everything locked inside. They begin sharing not just what they're thinking, but what they're feeling. Not just surface level updates, but genuine emotional content. I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm noticing my instinct to pull away, but I want to talk about it instead of just disappearing. Or, I feel scared when we talk about the future because commitment triggers my fear of being trapped, but I'm trying to work through that fear rather than avoiding the conversation entirely. This level of transparency about their internal process is revolutionary for an avoidant because it requires them to be vulnerable about the very fears and patterns they've historically hidden. The shift also manifests in the avoidant's willingness to discuss the relationship's problems and their role in creating them. They stop pretending everything is fine when it's not. They acknowledge when their withdrawal has caused hurt. They recognize patterns across arguments or difficulties, rather than treating each incident as isolated. I can see that I do this. I get close, and then I create distance. I'm seeing how that affects you, and I want to understand why I do it so I can stop. Or, you're right that I shut down when you express needs. I'm working on staying open instead of getting defensive. This pattern recognition and acknowledgement is crucial because it shows the avoidant is developing insight into their behavior rather than remaining unconscious about their impact. The transformation includes the avoidant bringing up future planning conversations rather than avoiding them. Previously, any mention of the future might have triggered withdrawal, discussions about moving in together, meeting family, long-term commitment, or life goals felt suffocating and abstract. But when genuine shift occurs, the avoidant initiates these conversations because they're actively imagining a future with you, rather than keeping the relationship in perpetual present tense. They ask about your long-term goals and share their own. They discuss how you might navigate upcoming transitions together. They bring up topics like, where do you see us living eventually? Or, have you thought about what you want from our relationship long-term? Not from pressure, but from genuine curiosity and desire to build something lasting. This shift toward initiating difficult conversations rather than avoiding them fundamentally changes the relationship's dynamic because it removes the burden of you having to raise every issue, manage every difficulty, and push for every important discussion. The emotional labor becomes shared rather than one-sided. The avoidant is taking responsibility for their own growth and for the relationship's health, rather than passively accepting whatever you create through your effort. This sharing of responsibility is what makes the relationship sustainable in ways it wasn't before, and it's one of the clearest indicators that the avoidant has moved beyond managing their patterns toward genuinely healing them because they value the relationship and you enough to face everything they've been avoiding. They demonstrate consistency without you demanding it. The second shift that indicates genuine love and transformation in an avoidant is when they begin demonstrating consistency in their availability, communication, and emotional presence without you having to demand it, ask for it, or remind them constantly. Consistency has always been the avoidant's greatest challenge. Their patterns create unpredictability, where you never know which version of them you'll encounter, where their availability fluctuates based on their internal comfort level, rather than on commitment to showing up reliably. When an avoidant begins maintaining consistency, not from external pressure but from internal motivation, it reveals that they've developed capacity to tolerate the sustained intimacy that consistency requires, and that they value your security enough to override their discomfort. This shift manifests first in consistent communication patterns, where you're no longer experiencing days of silence followed by sudden re-engagement. The avoidant maintains regular contact, not because you've demanded it, but because they genuinely want to stay connected. They check in throughout the day or week with a predictability that allows you to relax, rather than remaining in constant anxiety about when you'll hear from them next. This doesn't mean they're in constant contact. Healthy relationships include space and independence, but the contact that exists follows reliable patterns rather than the chaotic oscillation between intense presence and complete absence that characterize their previous behavior. The consistency also appears in the avoidant following through on commitments they make. Previously, plans might have been made and broken regularly, promises might have been offered and not kept, commitments might have been vague enough to allow easy escape. But when genuine shift occurs, the avoidant says what they'll do and then does it. If they commit to plans, they show up. If they promise to work on something, they actually work on it. If they say they'll call, they call. This follow-through is significant because it demonstrates that their words and actions are aligning, that they're building trustworthiness through reliability, that you can depend on what they tell you, rather than learning to discount their commitments as aspirational rather than actual. This transformation includes emotional consistency, where the avoidance warmth and engagement don't fluctuate wildly based on their anxiety about closeness. You're no longer experiencing the hot and cold pattern, where they're intensely present one week and completely withdrawn the next. Instead, they maintain relatively stable emotional availability even when they're stressed, even when intimacy deepens, even when circumstances might previously have triggered withdrawal. They've developed enough emotional regulation that their discomfort with closeness doesn't automatically translate into creating distance. This emotional steadiness allows the relationship to develop secure attachment because you're not constantly adjusting to their temperature changes. The shift also manifests in consistent prioritization of the relationship, where you're not constantly wondering whether you matter to them or whether they're about to disappear. The avoidant includes you in their life planning. They consider your schedule when making their plans. They check with you about decisions that affect both of you. They demonstrate through daily choices that the relationship is important rather than peripheral, that you're a priority rather than an option they pursue when nothing else demands their attention. This prioritization doesn't mean they abandon their independence. It means they've integrated the relationship into their life structure rather than keeping it separate and optional. This transformation includes the avoidant maintaining presence during difficult periods rather than withdrawing when stress increases or when the relationship faces challenges. Previously, external stress might have caused them to pull away from the relationship, to focus solely on managing whatever difficulty they faced alone. But when genuine shift occurs, they stay connected even during hard times. They reach out for support rather than isolating. They communicate about what they're dealing with rather than disappearing. They allow you to be present during difficulty rather than shutting you out. This capacity to remain connected during stress is crucial because it reveals they're no longer using withdrawal as their primary coping mechanism. The consistency also appears in the avoidant's physical presence becoming reliable rather than sporadic. They show up for dates and gatherings rather than canceling frequently. They're on time rather than chronically late or vague about when they'll arrive. They spend time with you regularly enough that you can predict when you'll see each other, rather than experiencing long gaps punctuated by sudden intensive contact. This predictability in physical presence creates security that allows the relationship to deepen because you're not constantly in survival mode, wondering when you'll see them again. This shift toward consistency without you demanding it is perhaps the most tangible evidence of transformation, because consistency requires the avoidant to override their instincts repeatedly over time. It's not a single act of will, but a sustained commitment to showing up, even when their nervous system is telling them to retreat, even when intimacy feels uncomfortable, even when their patterns are pulling them toward distance. The fact that they maintain this consistency not because you're threatening to leave or because they're in a temporary panic about losing you, but because they've genuinely developed capacity for sustained presence reveals that the change is internal and likely lasting rather than external and temporary. They acknowledge their patterns and take accountability. The third shift that indicates genuine love and transformation is when the avoidant begins acknowledging their attachment patterns explicitly, taking accountability for how those patterns have impacted you and the relationship, and doing visible work to address those patterns rather than defending them or minimizing their significance. For most of their life, the avoidant has operated with limited awareness of their patterns or has framed those patterns as preferences rather than wounds. They needed space. That was just who they were. They struggled with commitment. That was just their personality. When an avoidant begins to see and name their patterns as attachment wounds rather than as immutable traits, and when they take responsibility for addressing those wounds, it indicates a level of self-awareness and commitment to growth that's rare and precious. This shift manifests when the avoidant can articulate their patterns in conversations with you, demonstrating that they've developed insight into their behavior. They might say, "I recognize that I have avoidant attachment and that it makes me withdraw when I start feeling too close to someone." Or, "I can see the pattern where I pull away right after we have really connected experiences." This articulation shows they're no longer unconscious about their behavior, no longer mystified by their own responses, no longer able to pretend that their withdrawal is random or situational rather than patterned and rooted in attachment wounds. The ability to name the pattern is the first step toward being able to interrupt it. The accountability also appears when the avoidant acknowledges the impact their patterns have had on you specifically, rather than speaking only in abstract terms about avoidant attachment. They recognize and verbalize how their withdrawal created insecurity for you, how their inconsistency made you anxious, how their emotional unavailability left you feeling lonely, despite being in a relationship. "I understand that when I disappeared for a week without explanation, it hurt you and made you feel unimportant. That wasn't fair, and I'm sorry." Or, "I can see how my pattern of getting close and then pulling away has created an emotional roller coaster for you. I take responsibility for that pain." This specific acknowledgement of impact on you reveals empathy and accountability rather than defensive self-protection. This transformation includes the avoidant seeking help to address their patterns rather than expecting them to resolve on their own or expecting you to accommodate them indefinitely. They enter therapy specifically to work on attachment wounds. They read books or articles about avoidant attachment and actually apply what they learn. They join support groups or seek coaching focused on developing secure attachment. This visible effort to address their patterns demonstrates that they recognize the patterns as problems to be solved rather than as features to be accepted, and that they're willing to invest time, money, and emotional energy into transformation rather than simply hoping they'll naturally outgrow their limitations. The shift also manifests in the avoidant catching themselves in their patterns and course correcting in real time, rather than only recognizing the pattern after damage is done. They notice when they're starting to withdraw and they communicate about it. "I'm feeling my instinct to pull away right now, but I'm choosing to stay present instead." Or, "I just realized I've been creating distance this week. Can we talk about what's triggering that?" This in-the-moment awareness and correction is advanced work that shows they're not just understanding their patterns intellectually, but developing capacity to notice and interrupt them as they're happening. This transformation includes the avoidant accepting that their patterns, not your needs, are what's creating relationship difficulty. Previously, They might have suggested that you were too needy, too demanding, too sensitive. But when genuine shift occurs, they stop deflecting responsibility onto you and acknowledge that their difficulty with sustained intimacy is the issue. The problem isn't that you want too much. The problem is that my attachment wounds make normal relationship closeness feel threatening to me. That's my issue to work on, not something you need to change about yourself. This reframing of where responsibility lies is crucial for the relationship's health because it stops you from trying to fix something in yourself that isn't broken. The accountability also appears in the avoidant making amends for past behavior, rather than expecting you to simply move forward without addressing ruptures they've created. They apologize specifically for times they've hurt you through their patterns. They acknowledge that their behavior, regardless of intent, caused real damage. They ask what they can do to repair, rather than assuming that acknowledgement alone is sufficient. This repair work demonstrates that they understand relationships require not just ceasing harmful behavior, but actively working to heal the wounds that behavior created. This shift toward pattern acknowledgement and accountability fundamentally changes the relationship because it removes the gaslighting dynamic where you questioned your own perceptions and needs. When the avoidant takes responsibility for their patterns, it validates your experience, confirms that what you've been seeing and feeling is real, and creates shared understanding of the relationship's challenges. This shared understanding makes collaborative problem-solving possible, whereas previously, you were trying to address problems the avoidant wouldn't acknowledge existed. The avoidant's willingness to see themselves clearly, to admit their limitations, and to work actively on transformation reveals love that's mature enough to include accountability, growth-oriented enough to seek change, and secure enough to be vulnerable about weakness, rather than defending against all criticism to maintain an illusion of being problem-free. They prioritize your needs without resentment. The fourth shift that indicates genuine love and transformation in an avoidant is when they begin actively prioritizing your needs and the relationship's needs without resentment, without keeping score, and without treating your needs as burdens they're heroically tolerating. Throughout most relationships with avoidance, partners' needs are framed as demands, as pressure, as threats to the avoidant's autonomy. The avoidant either dismisses these needs as excessive or accommodates them with visible reluctance that makes you feel guilty for having needs at all. When an avoidant shifts to genuinely prioritizing your needs as important rather than as inconvenient, when they meet those needs without making you feel like you're asking too much, it reveals a fundamental transformation in how they understand partnership and their role within it. This shift manifests when the avoidant asks about your needs proactively, rather than waiting for you to express them or ignoring them until they become crises. They check in with genuine curiosity about how you're feeling, what you need from them, whether there's anything they can do to support you. What do you need from me this week? Or, I want to make sure I'm showing up for you in ways that matter. What would feel most supportive right now? These questions aren't performative or defensive. They're genuine inquiries that demonstrate the avoidant recognizes that understanding and meeting your needs is part of partnership rather than an optional extra they provide when convenient. The prioritization also appears in the avoidant making adjustments to accommodate your needs without treating those adjustments as major sacrifices. If you need more communication, they increase their communication without constantly referencing how hard it is for them or how much they're stretching. If you need quality time, they make that time available without keeping a mental ledger of how much they're giving up for you. If you need emotional support during difficulty, they provide it without making you feel guilty for needing them. This lack of resentment is crucial because needs that are met with resentment don't feel met. They feel like burdens you're imposing, and this feeling makes you hesitant to express needs in the future. This transformation includes the avoidant balancing their need for space with your need for connection, rather than always prioritizing their comfort over yours. They recognize that healthy relationships involve both people's needs being honored. That compromise isn't always you adjusting to their limitations, but sometimes involves them stretching beyond their comfort zone to meet you. When they need space, they communicate it clearly and provide reassurance rather than just disappearing. When you need closeness, they provide it, even if it's not their instinctive preference in that moment. This balance demonstrates that they understand. Partnership requires both people to adjust rather than one person perpetually accommodating the other. The shift also manifests in the avoidant following through on meeting your needs consistently, rather than making temporary efforts that fade once they feel secure. They maintain the changes they've made. They continue the behaviors that you've expressed matter to you. They don't revert to old patterns once the immediate threat of you leaving has passed. This sustained prioritization reveals that they've internalized the importance of meeting your needs rather than simply performing change to prevent loss, and it demonstrates that their motivation comes from love and commitment rather than from fear and crisis management. This transformation includes the avoidant anticipating your needs based on knowing you well, rather than waiting for explicit instruction every time. They remember what's important to you and act on that knowledge. They notice when you're stressed and offer support without being asked. They plan things they know you'll enjoy. They show up in ways that are specifically meaningful to you, rather than showing up in generic ways that don't actually meet your particular needs. This attentiveness demonstrates that they're genuinely invested in understanding and caring for you as an individual, rather than treating you as an interchangeable partner whose needs are obstacles to their comfort. The prioritization also appears in the avoidant making you feel valued for having needs, rather than making you feel problematic for expressing them. When you communicate what you need, they respond with interest and care, rather than defensiveness and deflection. They thank you for telling them, rather than suggesting you're being demanding. They treat your vulnerability in sharing needs as trust, rather than as pressure. This receptiveness to your needs creates safety that allows you to continue being honest about what you require from partnership, rather than learning to suppress and minimize your needs to avoid the avoidant's negative reaction. This shift toward prioritizing your needs without resentment fundamentally changes the relationship, because it removes the dynamic where you feel guilty for wanting basic elements of partnership, where your needs are constantly negotiated downward, where asking for anything feels like risking the avoidant's withdrawal. When the avoidant genuinely prioritizes your needs as important rather than burdensome, it creates space for you to show up authentically rather than in perpetually minimized form. It allows the relationship to meet both people's needs, rather than only serving the avoidant's need for minimal demand and maximum autonomy. And it demonstrates that the avoidant has developed enough secure attachment that they can see beyond their own comfort to recognize that caring for you and meeting your needs is part of what makes the relationship valuable, rather than what makes it threatening. They make you central to their future, rather than keeping you peripheral. The fifth and perhaps most profound shift that indicates genuine love and transformation is when the avoidant begins making you central to their future planning and their sense of identity, rather than keeping you peripheral, optional, and separate from their core life. Avoidants typically compartmentalize relationships, keeping partners in a separate box that doesn't touch their career, their friendships, their family, their long-term plans. This compartmentalization allows them to maintain the illusion of easy exit, the feeling that they could leave without their entire life being disrupted. When an avoidant begins integrating you into every aspect of their life and their future, When they make decisions with consideration of how those decisions affect you, when they present you as central rather than peripheral, it reveals that they've moved from keeping one foot out the door to genuine commitment. This shift manifests when the avoidant begins including you in future planning in concrete rather than vague ways. They don't just talk abstractly about someday or eventually. They discuss specific timelines for shared goals. I think we should look at moving in together next spring. Or, I want to plan a trip together for next summer. Where should we go? Or, I've been thinking about where we want to be in 5 years, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. This specificity demonstrates that they're actually imagining a future with you, rather than keeping the future abstract enough that commitment remains theoretical. The shift from vague to specific future talk is significant because specificity requires the avoidant to confront their fear of commitment directly, rather than hiding behind ambiguity. The integration also appears when the avoidant introduces you into previously separate areas of their life. They bring you to work events where previously they kept their professional life completely separate. They integrate you into their friend group rather than maintaining separate social worlds. They include you in family gatherings and holidays rather than keeping you away from family connections. They talk about you to important people in their life rather than keeping your existence compartmentalized. This introduction of you into all life areas demonstrates that they're not keeping you as an optional add-on, but making you a genuine part of their life's fabric. This transformation includes the avoidant making major life decisions with consideration of how those decisions impact you and the relationship. If they're considering a career change, they discuss it with you rather than making unilateral decisions and expecting you to adjust. If they're thinking about relocating, your life and preferences factor into the decision rather than being afterthoughts. If they're making financial choices that affect shared future, they include you in the planning. This consultation and consideration demonstrates that they see you as a partner whose life is intertwined with theirs, rather than as a separate individual who happens to be dating them, but whose needs don't constrain their choices. The shift also manifests in the avoidant, claiming the relationship publicly and proudly, rather than maintaining ambiguity about their commitment. They use clear relationship language. My partner, my girlfriend/boyfriend, the person I'm building a life with, rather than vague descriptors that keep commitment undefined. They're comfortable being seen as part of a couple rather than always positioning themselves as independent individuals who happen to be dating. They post about you on social media if that's part of their communication style. They mention you in professional contexts. They present you as important rather than downplaying the relationship's significance. This public claiming demonstrates that they're not keeping escape routes open or maintaining optionality about the relationship's status. This transformation includes the avoidant adjusting their life structure to accommodate shared life rather than expecting you to fit into their existing structure without any adjustment from them. They change their routines to include you. They modify their living space to make room for you. They adjust how they spend their time and energy to prioritize relationship building. They make compromises about how to spend holidays, where to live, how to structure weekends. These adjustments demonstrate that they understand partnership requires mutual accommodation rather than one person doing all the adjusting while the other maintains their preferred life structure unchanged. The integration also appears in the avoidant seeking your opinion and valuing your input on decisions rather than making all choices independently. They ask what you think about their career moves, their personal choices, their conflicts with others. They genuinely consider your perspective rather than asking for input but then ignoring it. They treat you as someone whose judgment they trust and whose opinion matters, rather than as someone whose thoughts are interesting but not actually influential. This valuing of your input demonstrates respect and recognition of you, as a true partner, rather than as an audience to their independently determined life. This shift toward making you central to their future, rather than peripheral, fundamentally transforms the relationship because it removes the constant insecurity about whether the relationship is real, whether you matter to them, whether you're building something lasting together, or whether you're just passing time until they decide to pursue something else. When the avoidant integrates you fully into their life and future, it creates the security that allows the relationship to deepen in ways that weren't possible when you were kept at the periphery. It demonstrates that they have overcome the core avoidant fear, that commitment means loss of self, and have recognized that genuine partnership actually enhances rather than diminishes identity, that making you central to their life doesn't mean losing themselves, but rather means building a richer, fuller life that includes deep connection alongside maintained autonomy. The avoidant who makes this shift is demonstrating the most profound form of love they're capable of expressing, the willingness to be vulnerable about their attachment, to let someone matter deeply enough that losing them would be devastating, to build a life where another person is woven into every major aspect rather than kept carefully separate. This integration is the opposite of every instinct the avoidant has developed, every protective strategy they've relied on, every defense they've built. When an avoidant chooses you over their defenses, chooses vulnerability over protection, chooses commitment over optionality, they're demonstrating love that's powerful enough to override decades of conditioning. This is not a love that comes easily to avoidance, which is precisely why recognizing it and honoring it is so important. If you see an avoidant making these shifts, initiating difficult conversations, demonstrating consistency, acknowledging their patterns, prioritizing your needs, and making you central to their future, you're witnessing something rare and valuable. An avoidant who loves you enough to become capable of the very intimacy their entire attachment system has been designed to avoid. An avoidant who has chosen growth over comfort, vulnerability over defense, and you over the protective strategies that have kept them safe but alone for most of their life.